Welcome back. Final lecture for chapter 5. We're talking about the challenges of being a police officer. There are many, but nowadays, this is a quote, nowadays we're in a culture where everything's against the police, or at least in the areas I patrol, said Ernie Williams, an officer with the Philadelphia Police Department. So Officer Williams was reacting to anti-police publicity that spread throughout the country following a number of high-profile encounters in which unarmed suspects were injured or killed by law enforcement agents. The negative force of these incidents, often captured on smartphone video recordings, was made worse by the fact that in many cases, the police officer was white and the suspect was a member of a minority group. This frustration underscores many of the work-related issues that bind police officers together, while at the same time potentially alienating them from the society that they are sworn to protect and serve. So this is just something I want you to think about as we go into this chapter. It's a challenging area to discuss because there are so many views on it. But let's talk a little bit about police subculture. In a national poll, 86% of nearly 8,000 respondents agreed that the American public does not understand the risks and challenges of police work. There is definitely a huge disconnect, you guys, between law enforcement and civilians. And this is called the police subculture, or a disconnect between that police subculture. And this term describes these basic assumptions and values that really permeate law enforcement agencies. And they're taught to new members of law enforcement as a proper way to think and perceive and act. From the very first day, you begin this process of socialization as a rookie officer, and you're taught these values. A theorist, Harry Mullins, believes that the following rituals are critical to police officers' acceptance and even embracing of the police subculture. And they are attending the academy, check. Working with a senior officer who passes on lessons, check. Making the initial felony arrest, check. Using force to make an arrest for the first time, yes. Using or witnessing deadly force. I'm not sure, you guys, that I can check that. Well, no, yes, check. Witnessing major traumatic events for the first time, check, yes. So I definitely can check all those. I had to think about the deadly force and yes. So those are all definite things that kind of make you your own. And I will say that the thing about being a police officer is that it starts to become who you are, not so much just your profession or your job, but really who you are. And that can be a hard thing to step away from. So each of those rituals we talk about really encompass what is normal for that officer, but definitely not normal for citizens. It's not a normal type of job. The only other people who can really understand the stressors of police work are other officers. And consequently, because of that, officers tend to isolate themselves from civilians. And this is so true. Your families become friends. You do all your social things with other officers. It starts to create this isolation. And what happens with that is there's mistrust. There starts to become this us versus them feeling towards, those outside of the police force. And in this outlook, sociologist William Wesley called the blue curtain, which was known as the blue wall of silence or simply the code. And that curtain really started to separate, or separates, not started, been like this for many years, the police from the civilians that they are meant to protect. So, of course, some challenges, the physical dangers. Police officers learn early in their careers that nothing is routine. Every day you go to work, you put on your uniform, you get in your car and check 10-8, which means in service. You hope and pray that you'll be coming home that night to your family. but every day that you go to work, you don't know that you'll be coming home to your family. There are no guarantees. So generally speaking, half of all law enforcement injuries are due to accidents, and about 2/3 of those injuries occur when officers are doing something other than just making an arrest. So there are so many stressors that need to definitely be talked about. So you have your physical dangers, and you also have considerable mental pressure and stress. And these conditions cause stress in one's life, and there's worries that happen from that. I'm sorry, I keep yawning, you guys, and I don't know why. It's the middle of the day. So every job has its own stressors, but police really in particular are vulnerable to a lot of occupational pressures. Constant fear of being victim of a crime, exposure to violent crime, need to comply with the law in every job action they take, lack of community support, negative media cover. And police officers face a number of internal pressures as well, limited opportunities for career advancement, excessive paperwork, low wage and benefits. Police stress can really manifest itself in different ways. A study found from University of Buffalo found that the stresses of law enforcement often lead to high blood pressure and heart problems. And if the stress becomes overwhelming, officers suffer from burnout, which becomes basically physical and mental exhaustion. Let's talk about police use of force. So it's generally accepted that not only is the police use of force inevitable, but that law enforcement agents who are unwilling to use force cannot do their jobs effectively. The quote, "The police officer always causes the trouble," stated in an appeals court in one well-known use of force case. Quote, "But it is trouble which the police officer is sworn to cause, which society pays him to cause, and which, if kept within constitutional limits, society praises the officer for causing." So in general, the use of physical force by law enforcement personnel is very rare. It occurs in only about 1.6% of 44 million annual police public encounters. Law enforcement agents are also usually justified in using that force to make an arrest or to prevent suspects from escaping or to restrain suspects or other individuals. But at the same time, few observers would be naive enough to believe that the police are always justified in the use of force. So to provide guidance for officers in this kind of tricky area, nearly all agencies have a use of force matrix. So we'll go through this use of force matrix. So to comply with various and not always consistent laws concerning the use of force, a police officer has to understand the two types and kinds of forces, non-deadly and deadly. Right? So in most states, the use of non-deadly force is regulated by a concept of reasonable force. And reasonable force allows the use of non-deadly force when a reasonable person would assume that such force was necessary for the officer to carry out his or her legal duties. I just want to say that I just feel like I was jumped back into the police academy because that was something that we had to memorize. Anyways, so in contrast, we have non-deadly force, and deadly force is force that an objective police officer realizes will place the subject in direct threat of serious injury or death. So let's talk about the Supreme Court and use of force. So, we went through those. You guys are going to want to know these for sure. Okay, so Supreme Court, some big case law that you guys are going to want to know. Tennessee v. Garner, 1985. And what happened is this was when Memphis police officers, Elton Hyman, shot and killed a suspect who was trying to climb over a fence after stealing $10 from a house. And the officer testified that he had been trained to shoot to keep a suspect from escaping. And indeed, Tennessee law at that time allowed police officers to apprehend fleeing suspects in that manner. Excuse me. So in reviewing that case, you look at this, and the Supreme Court really focused on his action, not on his action, but on how the statute was written. And they ultimately found it unconstitutional. Oops. When the suspect poses no immediate threat to the officer and no threat to others, the use of deadly force is unjustified. It is not better than all felony suspects die than that they escape. So we call that the Tennessee v. Garner, the fleeing felon law. Fleeing felon law. So just because someone runs from you, a felon, he broke into a house and stole some money. That's burglary. That's a felony. Doesn't mean it's okay to shoot him as he's trying to escape arrest. So this court's decision forced 23 states to change their fleeing felon laws. It did not completely eliminate police discretion. Police officers still can use deadly force if they have probable cause to believe that that suspect that's fleeing poses a threat of serious injury or death to police officers or others. So that's what has to be remembered. Does that fleeing suspect, what is he fleeing from? Is he fleeing from just, you as a police officer watching him strangle a woman and leaving her to die? Well, he poses a risk to society and myself. He's just killed someone. So I want you guys to think about the fact that officers have to make these split-second decisions. Split-second decisions. Life or death. It's a lot of stress. So 4 years after the Garner case came this other case that was called Graham v. Conner, 1989 Supreme Court case. And it stated the use of any force should be judged by the reasonableness of the officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision of hindsight. Hindsight's 20/20, right? We say that. If we could look at something and be able to look back at it and know what we should have done, that's one thing. But Graham v. Conner tells us that we have to look at the reasonableness of the officer on the scene at that time. So in 2004, the court modified the rule and suggested that an officer's use of force could be reasonable, even if by objective measures, the force was not needed to protect the officer or others. So they're looking at those objective measures. So when polled, African Americans consistently express less confidence in police than do whites. And this mistrust can be at least partially attributed to a number of recent use of force incidents that have been caught on videotape, which unarmed young Black men were killed by law enforcement officers. So 2 studies that were released in July of 2016 seem to confirm those suspicions. The first was conducted by the Center for Police Equity, and that showed that police were 3.6 times as likely to use force against Black suspects as against whites. And the second, carried out by Harvard economics professor Roland Fryer Jr., found that Blacks were 50% more likely to be exposed to non-lethal force, such as being handcuffed or pushed to the ground. In addition to this, a recent Justice Department study indicated that although police pull over white, Black, Latino drivers at similar rates, Blacks and Latinos are more than 3 times more likely to be searched following that stop. These statistics really support the controversial contention that racial profiling by police in the United States is widespread. So in situations where a police officer, police corruption. So in situations where a police officer does not act with evident bias, he or she may be subject to federal prosecution or civil actions. A civil rights violation involves the denial of the rights afforded to all Americans by the United States Constitution. And because the Constitution prohibits government officials from discriminating against citizens on the basis of race or ethnicity, many police lawsuits involve members of minority groups. So, how important really are ethics in policing? So important. So, if excessive force is a strong misuse of authority by law enforcement, then soft misuse of this authority manifests itself in police corruption. For general purposes, police corruption can be defined as the misuse of authority by a law enforcement officer in a manner designed to produce personal gain. So, some dilemmas that come up with ethics. I just want to make sure we're still on the same page here with my PowerPoint. So, some dilemmas that come up with ethics. There are so many rules that govern policing. Police officers often find themselves tempted by a phenomenon called noble cause corruption. And this type of corruption occurs when, in the words of John Crank and Michael Saldero, quote, officers do bad things because they believe the outcomes will be good. So examples of noble cause corruption include planting evidence or lying in court to help convict someone that the officer knows to be guilty. So let's talk about some elements of ethics. So Pollock and Becker, both of whom have extensive experience as ethics instructors for police departments, further identified 4 categories of ethical dilemmas involving discretion, duty, honesty, and loyalty. Discretion is where the law provides rigid guidelines for how police officers must act and how they cannot act, but it does not offer guidelines for how officers should act in many circumstances. The concept of discretion is linked with duty, or the obligation to act in a certain manner. Honesty is a critical attribute for an ethical police officer. And loyalty is what should a police officer do if he or she witnesses a partner using excessive force on a suspect? The choice often sets loyalty against ethics, especially if the officer does not condone the violence. So Brandon, it's Zudima, and H. Wayne Duff, they were captains with the Lynchburg, Virginia Police Department, believe that law enforcement administrators can encourage ethical policing through the following ways. 1, incorporating ethics into the department's mission statement, conducting training in ethics, accepting honest mistakes and really helping police officers learn from those mistakes, and also adopting a zero tolerance policy, saying that we do not support officers with unethical decisions when the mistakes are not so honest. So that concludes this chapter, a long one, yes, I know, but great job listening and happy lecture note taking.